All right, you're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lake. Thanks for joining us tonight. Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast platform or you're watching live on YouTube, thanks for being here. This is our weekly installment where I answer your aviation questions, and we just have good aviation discussions. So I've really been enjoying this. These questions mainly come from email and our Discord channel. So the Discord link, if you're watching live, is in the description below. And if you're watching on YouTube, it's in the description. And if you're listening on a podcast, it should be in the description. So you'd be able to find it somewhere. It's also on our vsl.aero website. You can find links to that. So it's really been growing. We get a lot of good discussions there throughout the week. So I've been enjoying that. Without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. So we've got Discord opened up here. We've got quite a few people in the audience. We've got 22 people watching live with us on Discord, and we've got probably some people live on YouTube. And I'm going to start out. I've got about 3 topics where I'm going to discuss those 3 topics, and then we'll open it up for your questions. If you have a question on YouTube right now, you can message it, and John, who I'll introduce here in a second, will read those over to me in Discord. I'll try to answer them. If I don't get to them this week, email me or join the Discord channel, ask them there. And then we'll move over to our Discord crew and have our discussion there and hopefully wrap up in about an hour or so. We'll see how it goes. John, if you want to introduce yourself real quick, I'll get my notes ready for the topics.
Sure. Unusual for me to go this early, but I'm John. I'm a CFI out of Rhode Island. I'm helping out Seth with his technical stuff, running the stream and moderating the questions. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask, and I can ask it on the show for you. Or if you're in the Discord live right now and you raise your hand during the question and answer portion, we can bring you up on the stage and you can ask Seth your question with your own voice. So yeah.
All right. Yeah, I really appreciate John. I really couldn't do this without John's help. So thanks for being here, John. Without any other housekeeping stuff, we're going to jump over to the topic of the day. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is From the Flight Deck, which is a website or service that the FAA has started somewhat recently. And I bring this up in a lot of my practical tests because in especially the CFI and the CFII and the MEI, all the instructor stuff, runway incursion avoidance is really important. And then really in any practical test, we're going to talk about runway incursion avoidance. It's a hot topic item for the FAA, and it's really important safety-wise. There's a lot of runway incursions that happen. So the FAA, I think, has done an excellent job of putting together a program to help stop runway incursions or educate the pilot population about runway incursions at certain airfields. And so if you go to the website, faa.gov/flight_deck, so FAA flight deck, if you just Google FAA from the flight deck, it'll be the first thing that pops up. You will find this website here, and it has this map. So we see this map of the country. All these little green dots are all areas that have from the flight deck kind of amplified information. So these are typically the busiest airports in the country. I'm just going to, at random, we're going to look at the Colorado Springs KCOS. So when we click on KCOS, over here on the right-hand side, you'll see we have a From the Flight Deck video, we have more information, and then we have a pilot handbook. Now, if you're on ForeFlight, you can open up your ForeFlight right now. You can go to KCOS, and in the Procedures tab, underneath Airfield, you will see the pilot handbook. So this is what that pilot handbook looks like. Let me make sure that pulled up. It did. Let's see. We'll always do that for, here we go. So your pilot handbook will have a link to the video, which are all posted on YouTube. So you can watch the YouTube video, which shows you how to basically fly safely into this airport. And then on ForeFlight, you'll also have this PDF document that I'm viewing here, which looks like this is an 8-page document that's just full of amplified information about what it takes to safely fly into Colorado Springs. What are some of the reasons why it's featured here? Because remember, all the airports that are featured here are all ones that have maybe a higher risk of runway incursions, or they're slightly more complicated for some reason or another. I've been to Colorado Springs several times. It's home of Space Force now. It's a Space Force base, but it used to be Peterson Air Force Base. So it's a joint use field, and I've landed on all of these runways here, so it can be very busy. You've got military, you've got civilian training, and you have a commercial terminal. Southwest Airlines, for instance, flies in to Colorado Springs. So all of these pages here list the specific hotspots, and they talk about in pretty great detail the problems that you might run into going into Colorado Springs. So all of these places are available from the flight deck website here on the FAA website. But if you're also using this if you're going on ForeFlight, go to the Procedures tab, Airfield, and if you see a pilot handbook, that's a good cue that the airport you're going to is maybe slightly more complicated than other airports. And I would highly encourage you to watch that video. The video production that the FAA has done here is really top notch. It's much better than the videos that I put out. So they do a great job of flying into the airport, the views from the actual general aviation aircraft. The narration is great. The production value is really high, and they're not extremely long. So I think they're around 5 or 6 minutes to watch the video, maybe 10 to 15 for something more complicated. So it's really digestible information, which I think is great. And then they combine it with that really good pilot handbook, which is integrated into the ForeFlight procedures again. So I think it's really good. If you don't know about the from the flight deck procedures and handbooks and videos, now you do, and go and watch them next time you're going out to an airport that you've never been to before. So that's also great to bring up if you've got a check ride coming up and the examiner asks you to go to one of these busy airports. If you're fortunate enough to do that, you maybe even work that in. If you're not, just make sure the examiner knows, hey, I'm aware of this great new system the FAA has called From the Flight Deck, these great videos. There's also a taxi simulator. You can type in FAA Taxi Simulator, and it has some scenarios that you can go through for taxi simulation that's really good to incorporate into your flight training. All right, that's that. I'll tell you what, this is the NDB Alpha into Russellville. We're going to have a longer conversation about that. I thought about doing this next, but actually that conversation I want to end with and then open it up for questions. So that's just a teaser of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about an NDB approach. They're still out there, folks. NDBs still exist. So NDBs matter. Well, we're going to talk about them. All right, this one is a airworthiness concern sheet. This is the first time I've seen this. I got an email this morning from our local FSDO saying that we had an airworthiness concern, which kind of caught my eye because I've never actually seen a sheet like this. And this is like late breaking information I just got this morning. And I thought, wow, an airworthiness concern that they're sending out. I might want to publicize this and talk about it and get other people talking about it because it sounds pretty important. So the narrative here, I'll read for those of us that are just listening in. On June 21st, 2023, so it's been a couple years, an accident occurred on a Champion 7EC Traveler equipped with a Continental Motors C90 reciprocating engine. The pilot noticed decrease in engine RPM during the takeoff climb and eventually lost engine power. Shortly after, the pilot performed a forced landing, resulting in substantial damage to the right wing and fuselage, the probable cause of the accident, as documented in the NTSB accident number, and it gives the accident number, which is CEN 23LA250, was a worn locking mechanism on a manual fuel primer pump, resulting in excess fuel being pulled into the engine. So this locking mechanism failed in the primer, and the engine began to run too rich. He lost power and essentially crashed, did a forced landing. So the locking mechanism, the airworthiness concern, is the worn primer pump mechanism, and this is from a Kohler company primer, engine primer. It has a picture of it on this airworthiness concern sheet, and I'm going to post a link to this sheet somehow. It's on a PDF, but I'll get a link on the Discord channel, and if you're listening to this later on YouTube, not live, there should be a link in the description. So if you have a primer like this, basically check your primer, folks. If you've got an old primer, it could cause an engine failure, and this is a good reminder that a lot of engine failure checklists or engine roughness, one of the things that we check early on in that checklist is the primer is in and locked. And so this was the locking mechanism was worn, and I don't think it was serviceable. So it was kind of in and locked, but it wasn't actually locked. I don't know that this is actually able to be completely locked. And so the retention pin where it locks and the end cap weren't mating together correctly. And so we had a failure here. So a worn primer pump could lead to an engine failure. So that needs to be something that you're pre-flighting. Make sure that that primer is in and locked and it's actually going to stick there. You know, that's really important. So I thought I'd bring that up. If you're out there and what we talked about this last week, actually, if you're at an AMT that has seen several of these different primers that have been worn and are not serviceable anymore, and they're the same brand, then that might drive what we talked about last week, which was a service difficulty report, an SDR. And so if enough SDRs are filed with the FAA, then that might drive a airworthiness directive. And so an AD would come out and say, hey, we've got all these SDRs that this component is not working. And the airworthiness concern sheet is another toolkit that they have to alert us of things that might be broken out there. So that's an alert for all you folks out there that might be dealing with primers that aren't working. Yeah. Is it Brenda or Brandon 170B? BRNDA. Brenda 170B. All right. They wrote to say that they loved a video that I did with Josh from Free Pilot Training. So if you haven't seen that video, I think it's called like 5 Weird Maneuvers. It's on the YouTube channel. And it's me and Josh, who runs the Free Pilot Training YouTube channel. And he does a lot of free pilot training, targeted mainly at the private pilot, instrument pilot level. But he came out to my airport there in Russellville, and we got up in his 172, and we did these weird maneuvers that you won't find really in the Airman Certification Standards. And one of them, I go through kind of my envelope discovery exercise is what I call it. And we talked about this recently too on the Discord channel. But what that exactly entails is you're going out and instead of just doing the circus tricks, right? A lot of times that we're doing checkride maneuvers, I think they turn into circus tricks. I've talked about this a lot, where you have a steep turn, you have slow flight, or you have a power on stall or a power off stall, and you're just doing it to do that maneuver. And you're not really learning the fundamentals of why are we doing stalls? How is this helping me become a better pilot? So the goal of doing these weird maneuvers that are outside the Airman Certification Standards is to hopefully kind of break up the monotony a little bit and also help you understand at a fundamental level the performance of your aircraft. It's one of my favorite things to do. So Brenda was asking, are there any other things that they could do? I think they made a modification to your 170, and hopefully you can get on here and chat about this here in a second. But they went from they basically changed props. And so getting familiar with this new prop and how it's going to affect the performance, what are some things that you can do? And so one of those things I think is really useful is the min controllable airspeed, the MCA. So this is a maneuver that is now in the instructor airman certification standards, where you actually you acknowledge the stall horn, but then you essentially ride the stall horn, because when the stall horn's going off, you're not actually stalled. That's a warning that comes just before you stall. So a min controllable airspeed, you would slow down below the stall horn and approach the full stall, but you want to keep adding power so you avoid a full stall, but you're kind of riding at a really high angle of attack, kind of hanging it on the prop. You're almost in a helicopter mode, you know. During this maneuver, you're probably going to have to go to full power. In fact, all the training aircraft that I've ever done the min controllable airspeed exercise in, you have to go to full power to actually get to MCA, because you're at a really high angle of attack. The ailerons essentially become completely unresponsive. And so you're flying the aircraft with really just rudder and power. And you're using the elevator to maintain an airspeed as necessary, but you don't want to descend. You want to try to maintain level flight. If you're descending, you're not doing it right. You want to have a low enough angle of attack where you can maintain altitude, but you're really just hanging it on the prop. And you'll notice that you'll probably be able to do this around 20 knots below, 15 knots below what your normal stall recovery would happen when you hear the stall horn. You can get the plane really slow depending on the aircraft that you're flying, right? And it also is depending on your configuration. So one of the things that I like to do with that MCA, again, to learn about your airplane, not just have that be a circus trick, is get to that MCA, see how slow you can fly it, and then start practicing with some stalls of, okay, I'm going to go power on and power off, and you're going to note where those power on and power off stalls occur. And then you're going to take and multiply that airspeed by 1.3 and then compare that to your manufacturer recommended approach speed. And what you'll find is your approach speeds are actually very, very close to 1.3 of the stall speed for that specific configuration. So power on, power off. So the way I might do an envelope discovery on a new prop for my aircraft, and I just saw that mention there, is, let's see, yeah, so they're changing from a climb prop to a cruise prop. So one of the things that I would want to do is I would want to get configured in a full landing configuration, so full flaps, and I would want to slow the airplane down and then see how it handles. What's the slowest speed? What's my min controllable airspeed with full power that I can maintain altitude? It's going to be something pretty slow. Okay, then I'm going to recover from that. Okay, now I'm going to go back into a full flap landing configuration, and I'm going to pull the power back to idle, and I'm going to hold the nose up until I get a full stall, not just a stall indication, but a full stall. And so this is my unaccelerated power off configured stall, right? I'm going to take that, I'm going to notate that number, and I'm going to multiply 1.3 by that number, and that's my actual approach speed. And right, that's that 1.3 VSO, that's coming straight out of the Airman Certification Standards. If you're doing a short field landing, you would want to fly 1.3 of your stall speed if you don't have a published short field approach speed. So always use the manufacturer's data. This isn't to replace manufacturer's data if you have it. It's just to validate it so you can understand where that number is actually coming from. Okay, the next thing is maybe at the higher end, I would figure out where some accelerated stalls are going to happen. Okay, the way I would do this exercise is I would set about a 50% power setting. So if you're in a 170, maybe a 20% or a 2,000 RPMs. So set 2,000 RPMs, and you want to stall the aircraft clean configuration, 2,000 RPMs in 1G. So don't accelerate it. You want to see where that stall happens. So it's going to be a power on stall, and I like to call this my 20-20-20 stall. So 2,000 RPMs, your first 20, 20 degrees nose up, your second 20, and 20 degrees of bank, your third 20. So you got these 3 20s set, and you want to do it as close to 1G as possible, and you see when that full break happens. Now, a lot of people are a little scared of doing a full stall in a turn because they've practiced probably most of the time in a straight and level stall configuration. So doing it in a turn is actually really good practice, and it'll build you a lot of confidence in the aircraft. Do it with a CFI that's comfortable with that. But what you might find is that inside wing might want to drop on you, and it can really add in some bank. You can get to 60 degrees of bank really fast, and if you're a little uncoordinated, you could even get into the beginnings of an incipient spin. And so what we're doing is we're kind of inoculating ourselves. Our gut instinct, our initial reaction is going to be to jerk that aileron to the left to try to level the wings. But we don't want to do that. Remember, that inside wing is already slower because it's our pivot wing. It's on the inside of the turn. So it's already slower, has a slightly higher angle of attack. If we were to turn the yoke to the left to try to go back to wings level, we're dropping the right-hand aileron into the slipstream, and that causes adverse yaw. It kind of acts like a rudder. So it slows that wing down further, and it increases that wing's angle of attack, driving it closer to a stall. So it could have the precise opposite effect, and it could make that wing actually fully stall and go in and lead to a spin. So what we're doing is, by doing a turning stall, we're forcing ourselves to think about, don't use the ailerons, and we're going to mash on the opposite rudder. We're basically practicing the pair recovery, and that pair recovery is our power to idle, ailerons neutral, rudder opposite, and release back pressure on the elevator. And basically we want to get that, we want to unload the wing and use the rudder, not the ailerons, to get us back to straight and level flight. The first time you do it, it's a little uncomfortable. But after a few iterations of this, you're going to see how powerful a flight control your rudder is at slow airspeeds. It's very, very effective. And you're going to be able to recover the aircraft from a left bank or a right bank full stall. And you might actually get into a higher bank angle. It might go past 20. but it will not spin if you do the proper recovery. And so by doing that stall series, we're doing a couple of things. We're getting ourselves comfortable not using aileron to recover from a spin or a incipient spin or a stall, just using rudder. The other thing we're doing is we're finding that unaccelerated kind of power on stall speed. So we also want to make note of where the stall speed happens there. So that stall speed is going to be different than your power off stall speed, right? Because you're at a different configuration. You want to do this in a clean configuration. Sure, you could try it with some flaps as well, but you want to take that, and that's going to be your higher end. And we're going to try to predict where an accelerated stall would happen at that same power setting. So an accelerated stall is something that's typically only practiced by most people, unfortunately, when they're preparing for their commercial check ride. But really, I think a private pilot should be exposed at least a demonstration, and why not even try it at the private pilot level or the student pilot level to an accelerated stall. So what an accelerated stall is just inducing a stall with load factor. We're increasing load factor to induce a stall. So there's this neat little formula that says that my stall speed increases by the square root of my load factor. And that sounds complicated, but let me break it down for a second. The stall speed, let's say your stall speed in this 20-20-20 maneuver, the stall speed was 60. Okay, that's when the full stall occurred, is at 60. So I know that in that same configuration, so clean with the same power setting, if I were to increase the load factor from 1 G to 2 Gs, that the load factor would increase by the square root of 2. And if you type that into your calculator and round up, it's basically 1.4. So a 2G turn, a 2G level turn, is done at 60 degrees of bank. So then we take the same configuration, clean configuration, power set to 20. We want to make sure we're below VA, or maneuvering speed. So make sure you're below maneuvering speed. So you got 2,000 RPM set, you're level, you're clean. Roll into a 60-degree bank turn and try to keep it level. And what you'll notice is the speed will start to decay, and we should reach a stall indication 40% higher than 60. I have to do the math on that. I think that's, what is that, 90, John? I shouldn't have done this without doing the math on it first. I'm not good at public math. 84. So if we got a stall indication at 60 knots, and I kind of conflated a couple things there, so let me clarify. In the 20-20-20 stall, that power on stall, you want to do it to a full stall a few times. That's going to help you practice that pair maneuver, that spin recovery. But you also want to take note of when the stall horn activates, right? You always want to do that. No matter what stall you're doing, if you hear a stall indication or you feel a stall buffet, acknowledge it, even if you plan on basically going past that to the full stall. That's a really important habit pattern, because all of the check rides that you do, you have to acknowledge any stall indication. Even if you're going to a full stall, you have to at least acknowledge the stall indication. So when you're doing that 20-20-20, acknowledge the stall indication, note where that happens. We're assuming it happens at around 60. The actual stall might happen at 50. But during an accelerated stall, we're not going to typically take an accelerated stall to a full break. We're going to take it to the first indication. So the indication at 1G, if it happened at 60, then that means at 2Gs, it's going to happen at 84. So what we're showing is that the same airplane, in the same configuration, in the same power setting, we can get a stall indication at 60 knots, and if we just add G, we can make that stall indication come on at 84. So I think that's a really good demonstration, because on the ground, we typically, hopefully, we've learned about how a stall can happen at any airspeed, but we're never really demonstrated the fact that it can happen at any airspeed. So that exercise can really help you understand the dynamics behind that. Okay, the second thing that I would do in a new aircraft is so I've done the min controllable airspeed, I've done the accelerated stalls, I'm kind of exploring that envelope there. The next thing I would do is explore the stability of the aircraft. And the way I would do this is I would get the aircraft trimmed out at a 50% power setting, wings level altitude, and spend a significant amount of time getting it trimmed out as perfectly as you can. And this demonstration really, or this exercise really only works on a very calm day. You want a pretty calm, stable air mass. If you're trying to do it and it's really bumpy, it's not going to work very well. It's just not. So a nice calm day, you're cruising along. Once you get it completely trimmed out, first try to fly it with no hands. Make sure you can let go of the yoke and just try to fly it with the rudder a little bit, right? Then you're going to test the stability of each axis. So the roll axis is what I would test first. And the roll axis, if you have a turn coordinator, what I would do is I would turn to a coordinated standard rate turn, left or right, you choose. Once you get established in that standard rate turn, let go of the controls and see what happens. Most aircraft, if they're rigged correctly and they're not bent, and some aircraft are actually bent or rigged incorrectly so that your results may vary, but most aircraft, when rigged correctly in a standard rate turn, when you let go of the controls, they're in what I call kind of the positive dynamic stability kind of cone, and they're going to correct back to level flight, right? So without you doing anything, the plane is just going to correct itself and come back to level flight. Again, this is in nice stable air and a nice rigged aircraft. And it may take a while, but that's a good demo to see. And that's a good demonstration to show you why we fly. One of the reasons why we like to fly a standard rate turn. Because in the next demo, you'll take it to beyond standard rate. Take it to 30 degrees of bank. And then let go of the yoke and see what happens. See if the aircraft diverges away and increases bank, or if it comes back to a positive dynamic stability back to wings level. See which one it does. Eventually, around 30 degrees or so, you're going to see the divergent characteristic. And what I mean by that is you go beyond that bank angle, you let go of the controls, the plane will diverge from stable and it will begin to increase bank into a steep spiral, and it will not recover. It will become kind of negative stable, if that's a thing. And that negative stability will drive it into an auto rotation event called a steep spiral, where it just continues to spiral and spiral down to the ground. And if that happens in IMC conditions mixed with some spatial disorientation, that's what we call a graveyard spiral, is because you've gotten in that auto rotation of a spiral. It's different than a spin, right? A spiral is characterized by a higher airspeed, increasing airspeed, steep bank, rapidly changing heading. It looks a lot like a spin, except your airspeed is going to be really high in a spiral. So if you ever find yourself in this situation where you think you're in a spin, look at the airspeed. If the airspeed is really low at or near stall, you're in a spin more than likely. And if it's really high, then you're in a spiral. And sometimes a spin recovery, you're spinning, right? So you're auto rotating, you're at a really high nose low. Sometimes you recover out of a spin and straight into a spiral. So kind of out of the fire into the frying pan, or out of the frying pan into the fire. I think I got that backwards the first time. Anyway, that's the stability demo I would do. And then I would do that same demo around the pitch. So take the pitch, get it nice trimmed, leveled off, moderate power setting, pull back on the yoke up to about 10 degrees nose high, and then let go and see what happens. And what you'll see is the longitudinal stability of your aircraft. It will begin to oscillate, and those oscillations should decrease in magnitude and eventually level off if you give it enough time. And I believe that's one of the demonstrations that I did on the 5 weird maneuvers with Josh. But you can also do that with power changes. You can reduce power and see how it descends, and increase power, see how it climbs. So those are actually kind of miniaturized versions of what test pilots are doing with a new aircraft. They're seeing the stability around the different axis of flight, and they're intentionally kind of disrupting the airplane and seeing what happens. Does it diverge from stable, or does it return back to kind of stasis there? So those are a couple of maneuvers I would do. And I look forward, hopefully you can jump on here and talk here in a second and see if all that made sense. And then Elias is a test pilot guy that's on here. He can correct me if I said something silly in the last few minutes. But before we get to that, we're going to get to what I was excited to show here, and that's this NDB approach. So let me switch up the screen here. Here's what you've all been waiting for. Okay, this came up in a question of, basically, the original question was, what's the deal with approaches that don't have a final approach fix? That's how we got down this rabbit hole here. So there are some approaches that don't have final approach fixes. They used to be a lot more common. And the first thing that came to mind was an NDB. Now, I learned a lot of my instrument flying with the Navy down in Corpus Christi, flying a C-12 with a crusty Marine instructor sitting next to me. And he was such a terrible, mean, awful instructor. And he would make me do these NDB approaches all the time down the coast of Texas. And it seems like Texas has like 1,000 NDB approaches into these tiny fields. So there was just always a new NDB approach for us to do. And he would make me do these needles only. He would kill all the other avionics. And all that I had was like a wet compass and a bearing pointer pointing to an NDB. And they don't have final approach fixes. So enough about my old war stories. Let's look at an actual approach that doesn't have a final approach fix. If you're listening on a podcast, I would take note of just try to find a local NDB approach and you'll hear what we're talking about. But I've got the NDB Alpha pulled up at KRUE. That's Romeo Uniform Echo. That's one of my home airports I fly out of a lot. And we have an actual operational NDB. It's one of the few that's out there. I think somebody on the channel said there's only 150 of these. I'll believe them, something like that. So how an NDB approach works is you don't need distance measuring equipment. And so when we look at this approach, we're going to assume we don't have GPS. All that we have is a bearing pointer, right? That's all you really need. You need a bearing pointer and a compass. It's a very, very simple approach. And what we have here is an NDB that's located basically on the field. And the inbound course is 360. And the procedure turn is to the south of the field. So you can kind of, if you're not watching the video, you can kind of imagine we've got this bearing into the field on a 360. The protected side is on the east side of that inbound course. And the only remain within restrictions that we have is remain within 10 nautical miles of the NDB. So immediately without DME, we've got to do some calculations here based on our ground speed. We have to figure out, well, where is 10 nautical miles? If we have no way of measuring the distance, then we can just use our known ground speed. So it's important, and this approach is going to change depending on what type of aircraft you're flying. But we're going to assume you're flying this approach at around 100 knots, just to make it easy. We're going to fly the approach at 100 knots. Maybe make it even easier. We'll just say that we're going 1.5 miles a minute is how fast we're going. We're doing 1.5 miles a minute, and we're flying this approach. We need to remain within 10 nautical miles. That's the only thing we have to do. So the first thing is, since we can't tell how far away we are from the NDB, the only way we can tell where we're at in relation to the NDB as far as distance is to fly over the NDB and get station passage, right? So I'm going to draw on this approach plate here. So for those of you listening, sorry, you won't really understand. But if we're coming in from the north, we would come in from the north and we would get a needle swing is what we'd call it. Our bearing pointer would go from to to from. And first it would get a little lazy because we're in the cone of confusion. So depending on our altitude, about 2 miles away, that thing will start to drift around and the head will start to fall really rapidly. Hopefully we've done our dead reckoning navigation good enough to know that, okay, we're getting close to the cone of confusion and it's going to needle swing on us and swing around. So now we know we've reached station passage. So if we're coming in from the north, this approach is easy because overhead the field, we know, okay, I'm over the NDB. And now I've verified my position on this map. I've verified where I am in relation to all these obstacles. So I can begin my descent down to the first MDA, or my first step down fix, which is 2,500 feet. So if I'm at 5,000 feet, man, I better hustle on down, right? Hopefully I'm at min vectoring altitude, which around here is at 4,000 feet. So I want to be at a fairly slow airspeed, my approach airspeed at that point. And remember, we're moving at 1.5 miles a minute. So I'll make it even simpler because I'm terrible at public math. I'm moving at 1 mile a minute. I'm in a really slow airplane. So I would hack the clock at needle swing, and I know that I need to be back inbound within 10 minutes because 1 mile a minute, 10 nautical miles is going to happen in 10 minutes. So that really means I have to do a 180-degree turn within the next 10 minutes. So if I start my turn at 10 minutes, that ain't going to work because that turn is going to take me outside the 10 nautical mile ring. That's going to be bad. So I really need to time outbound for probably 2 minutes. So now I've covered 2 miles. And then so there's my 2 miles there. And then I start my procedure turn. Well, I hack the clock again when I'm wings level outbound on the procedure turn. So that's another minute. So that's 1 minute, 2 minutes, another minute on the procedure turn. Then I'm going to do a 180 degree turn. Okay, so that's another minute, and then a minute inbound, and then fly inbound on the 360. And as soon as I'm established on the inbound course, I can descend down to my minimums, which in this case is 1240. So I'm going from 2500 to 1240. And I know that I can descend to 1240 because I've timed using what I think my ground speed is. I've timed from that initial station passage. So that's when I was coming in from the north. So I don't think there was a lot of questions about that. You can see how that would be pretty straightforward. I'll only have to fly over the NDB once if I'm coming in from the north, because then I just do the procedure turn. The next time I hit the NDB, hopefully I've already broken out and I just land on the runway. If I hit the NDB a second time, well, that's my missed approach point, and I need to execute the missed approach. Where it gets a little more complicated and where the question came up is, what if I'm coming in from the south? So I've got this feeder fix labeled on Victor Airway, and it's called OLAS, Oscar Lima Lima Alpha Sierra. So if I'm coming in from OLAS, could ATC clear me straight in and say, hey, you're cleared straight in for the NDB Alpha? Well, remember, we're looking at this approach. It doesn't require DME. So the only way that we could identify OLAS is with radar, right? ATC would have to tell us, you're at OLAS now, and we could hack the clock. And we see that OLAS is 15.4 miles away from the NDB. So we could do some math, and if we have the NDB tuned up, you could, in theory, I guess, track inbound and know that you can descend within 10 miles. So you're 15.4, so you would have to time for 5.4 minutes, moving at a mile a minute or whatever your ground speed is. So for our really easy math, we're just using 5.4. We time for 5.4 minutes and then start our descent in. You could do that. That's not the proper way to do this, though, because we can't start an approach unless we start the approach from an initial approach fix. And the only initial approach fix on this approach plate is the NDB itself. So we have to start the approach at the NDB. We don't have a choice. So we can't do this as a straight in. Well, that's a problem, because if we fly over this NDB and then we turn around, how are we going to turn around again? Tracking that could be really difficult. That not difficult, but it's going to add some time. We're going to do this little whiffer deal type maneuver. So that wouldn't be the best way to do it, I don't think. So the way I would do this approach, and the way I've done the approach before, is I would fly in south from OLAS until I hit station passage. So bam, I know where I'm at. I'm right over the NDB. I have station passage. So as soon as I have station passage, and that's stabilized as I'm outbound now, I start a standard rate turn to the right to a heading of my 180, which is my outbound. And as soon as I'm outbound, then I look at my needle. So my needle should be pointing at a 90-degree angle to my right, pointing at that NDB that's over there to my right. I know that I just passed it 1 minute ago because I've done a 180-degree turn. So now I'm going to beam my point, and I go wings level, and I hack the clock. And I time, let's say I time for 2 minutes outbound. So I proceed out 2 miles, and then I turn back inbound to intercept my course. And as soon as I get within that 10 degrees that I can consider myself established, my 10 degrees of my inbound course of 360, I start my descent down from 2500 down to my minimums of 1240. So I actually just turn this approach into a little hold pattern is all I would do. And I'm paralleling the course outbound and then re-intercepting the course back inbound. I started the approach at the NDB, at the initial approach fix, and I did a course reversal, but I didn't fly the barb. But there's nothing legally that says I have to fly the barb, right? This procedure turn, that's what we call the barb here. That procedure turn is simply a recommendation. It's a recommended procedure of, hey, you can fly these headings, and that's going to result in you reversing course in organized fashion, right? But it's not compulsory. So you could do a 90-270. That's a course reversal you could do. You could do a holding in lieu of, which is what I just explained. So I, coming in from the south from Olas, I would pass over the NDB. As soon as I have station passage, start my turn, fly outbound for 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, descend down to that 2500, then turn inbound. So I'm staying on the protected side of the airspace, descend down to my inbound, which is the 2500. And then once I'm established, descend down to my 1240, which is my category A and B circling minimums. So this approach is a circling approach. And this brings up another point of, okay, now we're circling and we're coming in perpendicular to the runway. So if we break out kind of late and we're not in a good position, let's say the wind's favoring runway 25, you could say, well, I would rather just cross over the runway and enter a right downwind for 25. That's actually not appropriate, right? The FAA wants us to fly a standard traffic pattern, and runway 25 is left-hand turn. So we need to break out early enough to be able to enter a left downwind for 25. Now, if we cross over, we could enter a left downwind for 7. So hopefully the winds are calm and we kind of have our choice, because what I would do and what I have done in the past when I've flown this approach for real in the weather is I've broken out, got the field in sight, I cross over midfield, enter the left downwind, and land on runway 7. And it just turns out that 1240, the minimums for this approach, is only about 150 feet below pattern altitude. So you're basically flying a standard traffic pattern here at Russellville. But that's how I would fly this approach. Hopefully that answers your question. Maybe it causes some other questions. We'll see. Those were the things I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to shut up for a second and let John field some questions if we have any.
Sounds good. Let me open up the Discord for requests. So if you have questions and you're watching live, just raise your hand and Seth or I can call you to the stage. We generally prioritize questions that are asked in Discord over anywhere else. So people who are watching on YouTube, that's your hint. But anyway, let's take a look.
We've got one from Paul here. I'm reading through on Discord. So Paul is asking a question about instrument stuff. He's gotten a couple of different answers from different instructors. So the RNAV A into SPK is an approach that comes in at a 45-degree angle to the runway. When landing on runway 12, the common thing taught at my school is to overfly midfield at minimums and then immediately enter the left downwind for 12. The ATIS announcement mentions to not do this and to cross at 7,000 and teardrop 2 miles away. Could you explain how you would want a student to fly this in a Checkride and possibly a general overview of how to fly this type of approach? This airport is close to my home airport and is commonly used. Wow, that's a interesting one. I'll have to look into that. I'll pull up that. Maybe if I have some time here in a second, I can pull up SPK. It could be because of some local restriction of why they want you to do that. Obviously, if it's IMC, I would want to see the viz minimums for that approach. But like the NDB that we have pulled up here, if you look at the minimums for this approach, it's only 1.25 miles. And this is a pretty high min approach. So I couldn't imagine it being more than a 1.25 miles. And so if ATIS is telling you to fly 2 miles away from the airport to do the circle, you obviously can't do that. So that doesn't really make sense, that they're telling you to do something you can't do, because that's even beyond your circling minimums or your circling radius for category A, which is only 1.3 miles. So I'll have to look more into that. That would be a good question. If you can help me remember, John, we'll move that over into the questions of Discord and I can answer that later.
My theory is that it's really going to be an ATC sort of directive on VFR days to do that. I would guess that they would remove that on an actual IFR a day where they are actually like, yeah, you have to do the proper approach. But on those VFR days, they're like, we're trying to help you out by allowing these practice approaches, but like this is the part of the practice approach that we can't do.
Yeah, and I've seen that happen with local Class Charlies that have a circling approach that make you do this big Hayaka maneuver. And I always tell my students, I'm like, hey, they're going to tell us to do this crazy descent profile and really sharp turn. Just know that if it was actual IMC and you were flying this, you would not be doing this. The only reason we're doing this is because back then we had to do that type of non-precision approach. So it was just kind of an ism. So that wouldn't be happening in real IMC. So
Dylan Davis on YouTube. Would you touch on how the weight of the aircraft affects stall speed in a steep bank? For example, in the downwind to base or base to final turns in the traffic pattern.
Okay, putting me on the spot here. So a heavier airplane, you are typically going to have a higher stall speed. You're going to require more load factor, or you could induce more load factor. And really, let's talk about load factor for a second. There's two ways you can make a plane heavier. You can put physical weight in the airplane, right, and make it heavier, like a dumbbell. You can put a 1,000-pound weight in the airplane, and it's 1,000 pounds heavier, right? But also, you could take that airplane, and let's say you have a 500-pound airplane. That's a really light airplane, but we'll just go with it. You have a 500-pound airplane, and you load it up with 2 Gs of force. Now that 500-pound airplane weighs 1,000 pounds. You've doubled the weight because now it's experiencing 2 units of gravity, right? So you've made the plane heavier. And anytime you make the plane heavier, you increase the stall speed by the square root of that load factor that you put on there. So that 2 Gs, the square root of 2, you've increased the stall speed. So load factor is a way of, and I'm probably oversimplifying this. I'm not a physics teacher here. I'm just using basic physics principles that we use in an airplane. But by making the plane heavier with load factor, you're increasing the stall speed. So in that realm, by making the plane physically heavier, you're also increasing the stall speed because you're requiring the wings to make more lift to overcome that. So yeah, when you're base to final turn, if you got overshooting winds on your base to final turn, and you try to increase bank angle and pull, well, that's adding load factor to the plane. You're making the plane heavier and therefore increasing your stall speed. So does that hopefully that answers your question. You're going to increase your stall speed. So that's a fine line to walk, because what that can lead to is if you don't really understand how your plane behaves there and understand that relationship, and you're not doing your patterns correctly, what that can lead to is you're afraid of steep banks. And I mean steep banks of anything, like I've heard people say only 20 degrees of bank in the pattern, or never get close to 30 degrees of bank. 1 degree over 30 degrees of bank and you might die in the pattern. And I don't want you to go there either, because you can bank to 30 degrees completely safe in the pattern. In the military, we bank to 45 degrees of bank in the pattern safely all the time. We have a lot of training to do that, but that's totally normal for us to do. So knowing that relationship of it's really dangerous if I'm trying to make that level turn or if I'm pulling back. It's that elevator pressure that you're putting in conjunction with a bank angle that's making things dangerous, increasing your stall speed. All right.
Great. Brandon in Discord asks, outside of the required items of the ACS, is there anything specific you like to dig into on a CFI initial check ride that you think that every CFI should know?
No, there's nothing outside of the ACS. I guess maybe the misunderstanding that I think a lot of CFIs have, and even some examiners I think that are giving this test, definitely not all of them. There's a lot of great examiners, but one of my personal irritations is when I hear of a CFI student that gets just asked straight questions about the FOIs, basically regurgitate what the FOIs are and the different laws of learning and that sort of deal. It's like, even myself, I have a working knowledge of the FOIs. I definitely don't have them all memorized, but what I really focus on is I focus on incorporating those fundamentals into the way that I teach. And so I would rather see, and what I give on my CFI initial is a fairly in-depth scenario. And what I hope to see is that you, as the instructor candidate, take that scenario and you implement the things you learned about fundamentals of instruction, and you implement that into a lesson plan and kind of a plan of action for how you're going to handle that scenario. That's what I'd rather see. I don't want to sit there and just ask you questions of the FOIs. So that's one of the things that I ask, but of course that's in the ACS. And then I ask a lot of failure modes of the different systems. That's one of the things I ask. But I'm not allowed to ask anything outside of the ACS. So I really do hold that as that's a hard line. So I stick with everything in the ACS. Don't go beyond that.
Movie Life Matt did follow up with his question that he wanted to ask. He saw your video on diversions in ForeFlight, and he's been building routes in ForeFlight and wondered if you know where ForeFlight gets its numbers. Does ForeFlight only give you ground track? Does it account for variation? And how do you apply it to deviation?
Okay, so ForeFlight does account, that's a good question. So ForeFlight does account for variation, but it does not account for deviation. So it doesn't know, and I don't know if ForeFlight plans on including that, because I could see where, from a programming standpoint, when you build your aircraft profile, you could put in basically the deviation table. So you could tell ForeFlight what your deviation actually is, and then it could properly give you deviation out. But outside of that capability, which I don't know if they're coming out with, they only give you a variation. And so you would need, especially for Checkride purposes, just to clarify things, you would want to write that in to your nav log that ForeFlight generates. You would want to write there along the side of the column if and how much deviation would occur for you to actually fly those headings in the plane. But ForeFlight does understand altitude winds, right? It grabs your altitude winds, it accounts for that. And remember, your altitude winds are in true, and so it also knows magnetic variation. That's a database that's loaded, in the background there. So it knows your variation at all these points. So it applies the appropriate variation for you to fly magnetic heading. So it gives you almost all the information you need.
Cherokee 180 on Discord is instructing an owner in their airplane and wants to know what are some things that they can look for regarding airworthiness. Things like insurance considerations. An example would be on a flight review, and just generally your experience or tips.
Well, for airworthiness, I mean, there's a lot of stuff you could do. What I notice is that a lot of owners, especially if they hadn't had the airplane that long, they haven't done an in-depth review of their airworthiness directives that are on their aircraft. And a couple of things that have concerned me about ADs is a lot of the ADs may have been complied with like back in 1975. Let's say you've got a 1965 airplane, and 10 years after it was manufactured, an AD came out back in 75. And it was a one-time compliance, and the AMP back in 75 complied with it, wrote it down on a sheet of paper, and every AMP since then has just assumed that AMP did it correctly. And here we are today in 2025, and we actually look. And I'll give you one example. There was an AD, I believe it was on a yoke or something with the flight controls, I forgot. But in order to comply with the AD, a small hole had to be drilled in the bottom of this yoke. So it's basically a witness mark. So anybody could come in and verify, yep, that AD was complied with because there's a witness mark here. And that's common across several different ADs to put some sort of witness mark on this component. So a future AMP or a future owner could verify, yeah, somebody didn't just pencil whip that AD, it was actually complied with, and I can tell because they put the appropriate witness mark. So we sat down with the new owner and we were kind of really scrubbing through the ADs, making sure they were actually complied with. And we got to this one part and the witness mark wasn't there. It was just not there. We looked, it wasn't painted over. It just wasn't there. And so we had to assume that at some point, either the component that had the AD complied with was removed and replaced with another component that didn't, or the AMP that said that they did the AD didn't do it appropriately, didn't put it. So basically they had a AD that wasn't complied with. And so we complied with it. We had the mechanic fix it, and it wasn't a big deal. But it could have been, right? Especially if that's an AD, that's a serious safety concern. So that's something to get the owner to really fundamentally understand when all these ADs were complied with, because depending on the aircraft, there might be dozens that have not been verified in years and maybe never. So that would be one good thing to do for airworthiness. Yeah, another good thing is to review the Plane Sense Handbook. So the FAA has the Plane Sense Handbook, which I'll pull up here real quick. And on the ACE guide, we've got Handbook 8083-19 Alpha. On the ACE guide, I've named this How to Purchase and Own an Aircraft, because the title of this manual drives me crazy. It's called Plane Sense, and that's a cute title, but I like descriptive titles. So I wish this title was called How to Purchase and Own an Aircraft, because that's really what this handbook is about. So this would be a great thing for you if you're a CFI and you have an owner-operator that you're giving a flight review to. I would use this Plane Sense Handbook to make sure you're giving them a good flight review. And then, of course, I would be wrong if I didn't bring up FAA safety at this point, but I'm also going to bring up, as well as FAAsafety.gov, I am going to bring up the AOPA. So if you go to activities on the FAA safety website, go to activities, and if you're going to give a flight review, you're going to search focused, and perform search. And what you're going to see is AOPA has 6 focused flight review profiles to choose from. And if you're an AOPA member, you get access to all of these 6 focused flight reviews. And notice how each focused flight review counts for 3 flight activities and 3 knowledge activities, enough to get 1 full phase of wings complete. And AOPA has a great resource. We can go to it right now. Continue to cite. Let me make sure that pulled up. It makes me log in and I don't have I'm in a different window here. But basically you have to be an AOPA member to get to the syllabus, and it has the full syllabus on how to conduct this and any extra resources that the Air Safety Institute has for you as an instructor. So if you're an instructor, man, the AOPA, the Air Safety Institute access that you have, all that stuff as an instructor, that's well worth the nominal membership fee every year. And that's one of the reasons why I renew every year, is to get access to that. So I would highly recommend doing that as well. Oh, Elias is typing. Elias, does Elias want to correct me? Oh yeah, I got music right here. Oh, I need to be able to change that because that's not great. Elias, do you have any? So Elias is asking me about instability, and you can jump on here. I'll invite you to speak. You can jump on here anytime you want. But what is the airplane that I've flown that has the most instability, the most unstable airplane? Probably a bent up trainer. Every once in a while I'll go up and I'll do a training flight and I'll do these demos in a plane that I've never flown before, and it's kind of not an older trainer that tends to get landed hard and beat up, and they're kind of beat up. But I'll do that stability demo and it does something completely unexpected. Like, I know this normally works, but in this airplane for some reason it's not working, and I think it's maybe bent a little bit.
Yeah,
so
I see that. I see that a lot with like stalls, where like when I was flying like really new Archers, every stall, power on or power off, the nose would drop and it would be great. It would be super easy. And now I'm flying these old beat up Warriors and wing drops every single time, no matter what you do. So yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think that wear and tear plays a big factor there too.
Yeah, when you're flying at the edge of the operating envelope, for sure. I think very small changes in the rigging of the wing, if the plane has had a wing removed and replaced, the installation of that wing, even if it's missing a couple of washers at the wing root or is dished out slightly different than the other one, like that can make a really big difference at the edge of the envelope. You won't notice it normally flying around, but at the lower end you will.
Have you ever had to adjust the ground adjustable trim tab?
Yeah. I've had to do that, and I'm trying to think of why we were doing this. It was on one of the airplanes that I've that I've flown in the past, and we made a change to it. And I forget what it was, maybe a weight and balance change, or maybe it was a student that flew it in, and it just felt like, hey, this is flying out of trim. We were needing to use a lot of, let's say, right rudder, even in cruise. So it had a ground adjustable trim tab, and all you do, the maintenance manuals will spell this out, but typically what they'll say is there's a duckbill, I guess, wrench, but it has these flat plates, and it can just go on either side of that, and you can adjust it a little bit. You want something, those duck bills are really flat plates. You don't want to use like a pair of pliers. I think it's just the duck bill pliers. And anyway, an AMP will know how to do that, or a knowledgeable AMP. And you want to make a very small adjustment, and the trim tabs are interesting because you go the opposite way that you think, because the trim tab is actually a flight control surface for the flight control surface. So in other words, if you feel like in cruise you need a lot of right rudder, well, you would want to move the ground adjustable trim tab to the left, not the right, because the ground adjustable trim tab moving to the left, it's going to hit the airflow and it's going to cause the rudder to move to the right. So that's self-critiquing though, because you'll make a very small adjustment, you'll take off and you're like, wow, that was worse. That made things worse. So I'm going to come back around and make a small adjustment the other way.
If you get inside of like something that's like a 2-seat trainer, kind of like a 150 or 152, and you feel, and you're on the right side as an instructor, the airplane is wanting to roll to the right naturally, and you're heavier than your student, so that maybe could be a reason why, where you have to kind of put some left aileron a lot, all the time, pretty much, just to stay wings level. There could be more fuel on the right. Also, that's another possibility. In that moment, stuff in the cargo or in the luggage compartment, there could be more stuff sitting on the right than the left. Maybe that's another thing. What do you think about, so you can adjust all of that kind of, you can maybe move stuff in the back to the left. I've done that before, and that's helped, I've noticed, with like wanting to roll in one direction or the other. What about the ground adjustable trim tab? Like, I know that's more for rudder, but as we know, like roll and yaw are connected together. So do you think that would help a little bit, you think, if we adjust that?
Yeah, if you're always dealing with that, I don't see a problem, as long as, again, you want to make very small changes with that trim tab. And somebody asked in the chat, can I adjust that? Paul Stevens asked, can you adjust the trim tab without an AMP and a logbook entry? That's a good question. I think so. I don't see why not, but I would definitely want somebody that's knowledgeable. Again, don't adjust it with the wrong thing, because the wrong set of tools, you're just going to bend that trim tab and damage it. And you can replace them, it's not a huge deal, but you don't want to break your aircraft if you don't have to. So yeah, you could do that. I ran into this, I borrowed a friend's RV6, and RV6 is side-by-side Van's RV, light experimental airplane. And I got in it to fly down to Dallas. It's just me, tank of fuel, and I had my suitcase, and I put my suitcase behind me. And on the way down there, and the RV6, you can't really reach and change it in flight. So by the time I got in cruise, I was like, man, I'm like leaning to the left. Then I'm thinking, yeah, I'm like the only one in here, and my suitcase is behind me. So I've got all the weight on the left-hand side of the plane. So I flew down there with a little bit of right stick the whole time. And then when I got back, or when I got down there and coming back, I put my suitcase all the way on the other side, and then all the other stuff that was in the airplane, put it on the other side to try to help balance that out. And that helped a little bit, So what you're explaining, yeah, that could definitely happen, I think, especially on a smaller airplane. You would know, just even though that arm of being just a few inches left or right of the CG, that could make a difference. And if you don't have adjustable aileron trim, and this is something you're constantly having to deal with, then yeah, I don't see a problem adjusting, do a flight where you're just doing the pattern, kind of give yourself an extended downwind where you can let go and see how that last adjustment fit, and make a few adjustments until you're happy with it. And then that'll make your life a lot easier in the training environment, if you have that in there. I don't see a problem with that.
So if it's rolling to the right, you're saying adjust the ground adjustable to the left, or?
Well, I got to think about this. So if it's rolling to the right, you want to put in left aileron. And left aileron would put the right aileron. And where's the ground adjustable trim tab? Is it on the left or right side? Because usually it's only on one side.
Yeah, in the back of the tail, it's on. I think it's on the right. I think it's on the right, like attached to the right side on the bottom of the rudder.
Oh, so you don't have aileron ground adjustable trim tab. There's only rudder. Oh, okay. Well, I don't know if that would help about the roll axis, though. You could try, but yeah, if it's wanting to pull to the right, and you feel like you need left rudder, then you want the rudder to move to the left, so you would move the ground adjustable trim tab to the right.
All right, we have a couple more questions now.
Yeah,
Caribbean Freddy is thinking about getting his CFI Sport rating, and he wants to train students to be a private pilot. Can he do that as a CFI Sport?
I don't believe so, but let's refer to the ECFR, my favorite document. Oh, is that somebody jumping in?
Yeah, I was just thinking through it. I mean, as a sports CFI, can he fly he can't fly a certified air. He can only fly light sport aircraft. That's one thing. That's a separate aspect, I guess, but it's kind of connected to it.
Yeah, you would be limited to sport pilot. Yeah, LSA. So I feel like I was talking about this in another show, but the sport pilot rules are my favorite rules in the FAR because they were written. I joked that they were written by Alex Trebek because they're all in a form of a question. Every single rule having to do with sport pilot is written in the form of a question. And it's funny, but it's also a little irritating because it's unlike any of the other FARs. So in the other FARs, there would be a specific section of flight instructors with a sport pilot rating, restrictions and limitations and restrictions section. But instead, in the 400 series of Part 61, we have to read all these questions. And we have to find the question that asks, what are my restrictions? What are the privileges? How about this? What are the limits of a flight instructor certificate with a sport pilot rating? And that's 61.415. So this would be your restrictions here. So you may not provide ground or flight training in any aircraft for which you do not hold a sport pilot certificate with applicable category aircraft or a pilot certificate with the applicable category class and applicable category and class privileges for your flight instructor certificate with a sport pilot rating. Let's see. Skimming through here. Yeah, I don't think you can. But I won't read through the FARs. That's terrible podcast content, but we can meet offline. At least the FAR you're looking at is 61.415. So read through 61.415 and then also read through 61.413, which are your privileges. So that's your privileges and limitations section of that.
So I guess one follow-on question that might help answer it as well is, how much of your private pilot certificate training can you perform in an LSA? We know the Checkride has to be in right? Doesn't it have to be in normal category aircraft? But how much of that training can you do?
I don't believe so. I think you can do the entire private pilot rating in a LSA. You just can't do it the other way around. You can't do a sport pilot in a normal category aircraft.
Right. Okay. Yeah, you can. All of your private pilot you can do in LSA, and there's several flight schools that do that exclusively use LSAs. So you can definitely do all of your private. You can't do all of your instrument. Most LSAs you can't do that. I say most because I think there might be a few LSAs that are actually instrument certificated. And for the Checkride, you have to be in an instrument certificated aircraft. You can't do that in an LSA. So you could train, you could definitely get training in an LSA, instrument training in an LSA, as long as you weren't in actual instrument conditions, but you can't take the Checkride in it. So most people do their training in a certificated aircraft or normal certificate aircraft because they don't want to do training in an LSA and then have to do kind of Checkride prep in a certified aircraft and have to learn new systems. So they just do the whole instrument training all in one airplane. Kind of a related question here is Movie Life Matt asked, is there a benefit of utilizing Microsoft Flight Simulator for very low time student pilot Have you encountered any students who are primarily simmers that did well while training? Yes, I think so. I think it could really help. But I think it's a lot like learning how to play an instrument. It's like, well, if I practice Guitar Hero at home, is that going to make me a better guitar player? And I think it depends on, well, how are you practicing using that, right? Are you building bad habits doing that, using that tool and just kind of having fun with it? Or are you building disciplined habit patterns that are going to help you in the real world? So I think it's really important, if you're going to do this, is to get with an instructor with you on the simulator and have your instructor show you how to use that simulator appropriately, or else you're going to run the risk of maybe developing some bad habits. But I think if you use it correctly, yeah, it absolutely could help.
Got another YouTube question from Matthias. Brand new commercial pilot and is planning to roll right into CFI training and would appreciate any words of wisdom that you have for them. And if you would recommend making their own lesson plans or buying them.
I would buy lesson plans, tailor them for what you need, but I would buy lesson plans. Don't remake them. I've been through that a few times where it's just, don't make your own lesson plans. You can buy lesson plans and just know them. And what's more is us as examiners and out there in the real world, you're not being evaluated on your lesson plans. That's not something really that I'm giving a lot of credence to. You could come in and have excellent lesson plans that are they're beautiful, and they have all these amazing graphics and artwork and the spelling and grammar is, it's great, and the format is awesome. There's just mind-blowing lesson plans. And if you stand up and try to teach and you can't teach, well, then you're going to probably fail the check ride, because you've got to be able to teach. So it's not that I don't care about the lesson plans, but, I care a lot more about how you are presenting yourself and the material and your working knowledge of everything and your entire demeanor as an instructor. That's a lot more important to me than a fancy lesson plan. And it always kind of cracks me up. I see the CFIs come in, and most of them, maybe they're getting better now, but when I first started giving CFI initials, they would all walk in with this giant binder, and it's like yay thick, probably 4 or 5 inches thick. And I always wondered, what's in that binder? And do you think we're going to cover that whole binder in this check ride? And then when I go out into the kind of the area where the active instruction is happening, and I see all these CFIs and they're all giving lessons and talking to students, and I don't see a binder anywhere. None of them are using their big giant binder. So I was like, are you just making that binder for the test and then you just throw it away, or does this binder get recycled and handed to different people? But anyway, that's a little beside the point. Yeah, buy lesson plans and practice teaching. A great exercise is to practice teaching to your family members that aren't pilots. If you can explain something to someone who is not a pilot and is not an aviation nerd and is not interested in it at all, and you can hold their attention and you can explain how steep turns work, for instance, and when you ask them to kind of say it back to you, kind of evaluate their knowledge, and they retain the knowledge and they can tell you, kind of explain how to do a steep turn and why we would want to practice those, you're a good teacher. That's good. That takes some practice. So practice teaching. That's really important, is to practice teaching. Also, if you wanted to start doing some right seat flights in your commercial pilot training, there's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to wait until you're a CFI to sit in the right seat. So if your instructor's okay with it, and they probably will be because they're stuck over there in the right seat all the time, just say, hey boss, I'd like to sit in the right seat and do flight today, just to start getting used to that right seat sight picture and everything. They'll be like, yeah, sure, I'll sit in the left, and you get to sit in the right and experience that. Don't wait until you're instructor training to do that. So that's another thing that you might can do during your commercial training. Well,
we have
any more?
Yeah, I got one more.
Okay, yeah, let's do one more.
Sure. So George on YouTube, and that's actually a question I was like, oh, I've never heard that question asked before. But something that he noticed in the commercial regulations is that, and in his discussions, is that some people say that you need to be IFR current to do 50 nautical mile for higher flights as a commercial pilot. And some say that you just need the rating and you don't actually need to be current. So what's your thoughts?
Interesting. Yeah, I've never run into this. So let's look at 61133 is your commercial pilot limitations. Is it not there? I think that's actually in the instrument.
It's 61133 Bravo 1.
Oh, is it? I just looked past it. Okay, so a person who applies for a commercial pilot certificate with an airplane category or powered lift category rating and does not hold an instrument rating in the same category and class will be issued a commercial pilot certificate that contains the limitation, quote, the carriage of passengers for hire in airplanes on cross-country flights in excess of 50 nautical miles or at night is prohibited. The limitation may be removed when the person satisfactorily accomplishes the requirements listed in 6165 of this part for an instrument rating in the same category and class of aircraft listed on the person's commercial pilot certificate. Okay, so that's part 1 of the puzzle. Part 2, 6165, so that shows what's required for the instrument flight and the flight proficiency that you have to get for the instrument rating. And maybe the third part that we have to look at is in 61 general, which is your 6158, or sorry, the 6157, which is your recent flight experience. So the instrument experience, which is what they're talking about to be current in instrument, it's listed under 6157 paragraph C and says, except paragraph E of this section, a person may act as pilot in command under IFR or weather conditions less than minimum prescribed for VFR only if, and then it lists out the instrument requirements. So since you're a commercial pilot and you're not using instrument experience to fly under IFR, that's the only time you have to be current, is if you're going to act as pilot in command under IFR or weather conditions less than minimums as prescribed. It has no verbiage in there about saying you have to be instrument current. Also, there's not an and paragraph in here. And if you're going to do a flight over 70 nautical miles or at night with passengers as a commercial, that's not in there. So my take on this, unless there's another letter of interpretation that's out there, I would say you only have to hold an instrument rating. You do not have to be current. And again, the way we kind of went through that whole process is looking at the actual requirements. The limitation in 133 paragraph B says we can remove the limitation when you accomplish the requirements listed in 6165. If the intent was to also be current, I would expect this to say the limitation to be removed when the person satisfactorily accomplishes the requirements listed in 6165 and maintains currency in accordance with 6157. It doesn't say that. So because it doesn't say that, I think you just need to have the rating.
Yeah, the other aspect there that I would mention is if you don't have the rating, you get this limitation on your certificate that says you need this. If that limitation is not on your certificate, then it doesn't apply, right? There's no actual restriction there. And it doesn't say that there's a restriction of you have to be night current in order to do that. That's not on the rating. That's not on the certificate. So if your license says doesn't have a limitation, there is no limitation.
Yeah, exactly. And that would also cause a lot of problems, I would think, for commercial pilots that maybe don't maintain their instrument currency but are actively flying commercial operations. That would be a big deal. Like if you lose your instrument currency and all of a sudden you also can't do passenger flights greater than a certain distance, like that, that'd be a big deal.
All the cargo pilots in the world flying nighttime.
Yeah, it's like we're in trouble. All right, well, we are going to end the live show. Once again, thanks for joining us. If you are listening to this in the future and want to join us on a future live stream or join us on Discord, you can find links to a Discord at vsl.aero again, or the description of the video. You can also email me with questions. If you want to drop a question on the video itself or the comment section, do that. There's lots of ways to reach out. But I really appreciate everyone being here. We talked for a while. Thank you so much for your time, and we will see you next time.